This time it's 5 British motorcycles with inline engines. Throughout history there have been a large number of motorcycles fitted with their engines mounted inline along the frame. It is said that the first inline 4 was produced by FN, a Belgian company. This went on to inspire a number of American companies who are probably more famous for it these days. But there have been a number of notable British examples too. And I don't just mean one-offs like Milliard's amazing Viper-engined monster. The Sunbeam S7 and S8. Founded as a bicycle manufacturer by John Marsden, Sunbeam is a company best known for the high quality rather than necessarily the groundbreaking design of their motorcycles. And indeed they were one of the last big British companies to move on to saddle tanks. During the veteran and vintage eras they produced large numbers of single-cylinder and V-twin engine machines, but the company would fall into financial difficulties and would pass through various hands before being taken over by Associated Motorcycles in the mid-30s. AMC would produce a completely new range of high-cam single-cylinder engines, but unfortunately the outbreak of war would mean these machines would be produced for only a very short time, before AMC sold the name on to BSA in 1942. BSA were offered BMW's designs as war reparations, but decided to go their own way with a new Sunbeam. They brought in designer Erling Pope, who in the 1920s worked on the ill-fated P&P motorcycles, to design an all-new bike, which was very much influenced by BMW, at least in concept. The initial S7 model arrived in 1947 and had quite bulbous tyres and a very rounded look, which today you would call a bobber. The engine was a parallel 487cc twin, but rather than across the frame as was the convention at that point, Pope ran the engine inline, through a 4-speed gearbox and then shaft drive to the rear wheel. And then at the rear wheel, power was transmitted via a worm drive, something which would come to bite them on the backside a little bit later on. There were very chunky telescopic forks at the front and plunger suspension, on the production versions at least, at the rear. Prototypes had ran rigids. Initially the engine was bolted straight to the frame. This turned out to be a mistake when an initial batch was rushed over to South Africa for a royal visit and found to vibrate horrendously. The bike was then redesigned with rubber engine mounts. But this meant they had to add a flexible section into the exhaust pipe to stop it cracking, and this would be a source of rust. But a bigger problem was the rear worm drive, which wore rapidly. Sunbeam's solution to this, instead of redesigning the thing, was to simply detune the engine to 24 horsepower at 6,000 rpm. And as a result the intended sports version of the machine was permanently shelved. The engine unit was somewhat unusual in a number of ways. It was a single overhead cam unit of 487cc with a bore and stroke of 70 by 63.5, and the bike had a dry weight of some 430 pounds. But the bike was a slow seller and was changed very little throughout its lifetime. There would be the S8 version with less bulbous tyres and BSA A10 front forks, but that was about as adventurous as it got, because it was becoming all too apparent that BSA had frankly lost all interest in the project, and didn't have or didn't want to spend the cash to greatly improve it. The refined gentlemanly manners of the bike did mean that it had a firm following, but it was a small one, and so in 1957 BSA called an end to Sunbeam production. Francis Barnett, Pullman. Francis Barnett was a company founded in 1919 by Gordon Francis and Arthur Barnett in Lower Ford Street, Coventry. In the early days the company was best known for the development of its pull-top frame, which could be fitted with engines from various manufacturers including Blackburn and of course Villiers. And Villiers would power most of the machines until the adoption of the AMC engines in the late 50s. But perhaps the most interesting design was the Pullman. Arriving in 1927, it made use of an all-new Villiers inline twin-cylinder 2-stroke engine of 344cc, which was married up to a 3-speed gearbox and had chain final drive. And while looking radical, the engine was actually just two of their 175cc singles mounted in line of each other, employing the same bore and stroke of 57 by 67, and using a crankshaft of 180-degree spacings, which had the usual Villiers magneto system mounted at the front of the engine. The bike was never intended as a sports machine employing just a single carburettor, and was praised for its smoothness on release. Top speed, incidentally, was around 95 kilometers an hour. That's around 55 miles an hour for a 127 kilo bike, so despite its bulky looks, it was actually surprisingly light. At the top end, the engine had cast iron barrels with a single piece aluminium head. Inside could be found deflector pistons constructed of aluminium. Another advanced feature was the use of a pressurised automatic oil lubrication system, rather than the much more common premix used in most two-strokes of the period. However, those twin cylinders and automatic lubrication system did make the bike more expensive, and sales were very slow. Production would continue into 1928, but by early 1929, Francis Barnett decided to wind up production completely. And interestingly, few other companies would make use of the engine, although Monet Goyon in France would make use of the engine for a short period. The Royal Enfield 3. In the period immediately after World War I, Royal Enfield scrapped around looking for new ideas for machines and what they believed would be an immediate post-war boom. And one of the designs they came up with was a 675cc, 3-cylinder, inline, two-stroke. Now unfortunately, only the prototype of this very interesting machine was ever completed, but what I do know is it was based on their single-cylinder 225 two-stroke engine, which had first appeared in the range just before the start of hostilities in 1914, and in various forms would remain in production until the mid-30s. The engine had a bore and stroke of 60 by 70 and was described as a 3-port engine, that's 1 inlet and 2 exhausts, and in its single-cylinder 201 form was rated at 2¼ horsepower. This is of course a rating and not an exact figure, but it does give you some idea of the performance that was likely from the 3-cylinder job. The engine was a fairly conventional deflector piston 2-stroke, but did feature roller bearings, had an external flywheel and a 3-speed transmission. Power was then fed by a chain to the rear wheel, which featured a cush drive, something which Royal Enfield pioneered. In the single-cylinder form, top speed was around 35 miles an hour, so it was reasonable to expect that the 3-cylinder engine would have put somewhere out around 7 horsepower and gone around 55 miles an hour, had it been produced of course. The prototype features manual oiling, and the clutch, rather interestingly, sits just above the footboard on the left side, so the rider would have to reach below his left leg to operate the clutch, which I'm sure would have been interesting. The rest of the machine is pretty standard for the time, as acetylene lights and girder forks. Interestingly, in a forerunner to disc brakes, the bike uses a dummy rim on the side, rather similar to those that have been used for belt drive, into which runs a stirrup which applies the brake. I've seen a similar system on some competition Douglases of the period. Unfortunately, the bike would never reach production, so I'll never really know just how well it would have gone. The Wilkinson TMC. Wilkinson is a company best known today of course for its razor blades, but in the past it was involved in all manner of steelwork, including from 1903 motorcycles. They produced bikes between 1903 and 1905, but after a break would start again between 1912 and 1915. There's no doubt that the Wilkinsons are very unique looking motorcycles. The TMC simply stands for Touring Motorcycle incidentally. The first machine used an inlet over exhaust engine of 4 cylinders laid in line with a car type dry clutch and a 3-speed gearbox. Capacity was 678 cc's and it was rated at between 5 and 6 horsepower depending on model, with cast iron being used to forge both the crankcase and the top end. The front forks were a Chater Lee design, while the rear end used a leaf spring setup. Subsequent redesigns would see the engine adopt liquid cooling, and there would be a gradual increase in capacity too, from 848 to 1087 cc's in the final model. This model incidentally was also rated at around 6 to 7 horsepower. The sparks came courtesy of a Bosch Magneto, probably the best design available at that time, whilst lighting, in common with most machines of the era, was provided by acetylene. However, by 1915, with the war raging, Wilkinson ceased production of its motorcycles. The engine, however, would reappear in a small car in the post-war era. The Bru Superior BS4. The Bru Superior BS4 has to be one of the most unusual motorcycles ever produced in the United Kingdom, using as it does an Austin 7 engine and having 2 rear wheels. It is known that George Brough considered the 4-cylinder engine superior to the V-twins and single-cylinder engines that he'd used thus far, and indeed did develop some in-house engines of his own, such as the Dream model, none of which would go on to reach series production. However, in 1932, George Brough announced the BS4 or Straight 4. The machine made use of a modified Austin 7 engine, slightly increased in capacity to 797 cc's. However, the transmission came straight from the Austin 7 and would include the use of 2 rear wheels. And a reverse gear, of course. Brough could get away with this because the machine, unlike any previous Brough, was intended for sidecar use only. Or so you would think, because actually Hubert Chantley successfully completed the Land's End trial on one, riding solo. So I guess anything's possible, although I suspect Hubert must have been quite a rider. Fitted with a sidecar, the bike wasn't exactly rapid. The Austin 7 engine, of course, used a standard transmission and wasn't geared up. But it did generate plenty of torque and had really good traction with those extra 2 wheels, so would have made for an extremely good sidecar mount. The machine was only ever built in tiny numbers and cost around £1,000 to develop, around £50,000 in today's money, and each one was sold for around £188, so somewhat less than an SS100. But unfortunately only 10 were ever completed, with around half that number known to have survived. And in fact, so rare are these machines that the one stored at the National Motorcycle Museum is in fact a replica. But as with so many of Brough's designs, the fact that the bike didn't sell particularly well wasn't a major problem, because while not a great commercial success, it did generate an awful lot of publicity. What other collections of bikes would you like to see us do a video on? Or maybe you've got a bike we can use for a test ride. Either way, drop us a line below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.